Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Being here is an honor and a dream come true. For many years, I wanted to attend this conference, and not necessarily as a speaker, but I'm really glad I'm here with all of you either way. As Pat says, my name is Nelida, and I'm an introvert. But also, I'm a bit shy. And as you can probably imagine, my brain is full of thoughts on how to get away from here as quickly as I can. So let's get this done so I can go away and hide on my hotel room. No, I'm just kidding. I live here. Anyway, first, I must ask this question. How many of you identify as introvert? Okay, quite a few. Okay, now I want you to reflect on what were your thoughts when I said that I was an introvert and shy. Do you think those were the same things? Well, I used to think they were. Actually, most of my life, I have struggled with many negative feelings and wrongly attributing those to being an introvert. Some of those feelings range from lack of confidence, shyness, imposter syndrome, social awkwardness, among others. But a few years ago, there was this book that helped me to challenge some of those misconceptions. And I have the feeling that at least some of my fellow introverts here might know which book I'm talking about. Can you please raise your hand if have you read or at least heard about this book? Okay, not as much as I thought. Well, this book is great, really recommended for introverts and extroverts alike. I really like the approach of the author because I don't think she's only talking to introverts in this book. She believes that by understanding introversion, we all can benefit. Even if you're not an introvert, you are surrounded by them all the time, in your family, in your teams. So this book might help you to understand them a little bit better. But of course, I don't pretend to give the summary of the book or make the talk all about it. Instead, I want to talk about my personal journey on understanding myself as an introvert. Rest enough saying that this book was of a great help. And just for the purpose of being on the same page, I want to use the definition of introversion from this book. Susan Cain, the author of this book, says that introverts have a preference for a quiet, more minimally stimulating environment. And this stimulation can come in all different forms. Of course, it can be social stimulation, but also it can be in the environment, such as in lights, noise, etc. Now, let's compare this with shyness. The American Psychology Association defines shyness as a tendency to feel awkward, worried, or tense during social encounters, especially with unfamiliar people. Now, the big difference with these two is that the first one is part of your identity, whereas the second one is not. You can change being shy, but not an introvert. For example, as time has passed, I've been able to deal with my shyness a little bit better, and now I don't feel as anxious or worried on social situations, except if it's talking in front of hundreds of people. But no, in fact, I do love conferences such as this. I enjoy getting to know my fellow peers in the industry, learning about you, your work. However, no matter how much I enjoy it, after a few hours, I need some downtime because I get physically tired and mentally drained. So as much as I might enjoy other people's company, sometimes I just prefer to be alone, to be able to recover and gather my own thoughts. So, as we can see, even though these two concepts really have different meanings, I still think shyness and all the other negative feelings that I listed earlier are related and actually caused by the misunderstanding of introversion. Let's see a few examples. I'm from Mexico. We have big families. And I remember in celebrations, aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole family will gather. And they will make jokes about me always being in a corner with my computer and my books, even though everyone else was chatting and laughing and having a good time. I always laugh at the assumption here that I was not having a good time. Also, when I migrated to the United States, I faced a stereotype of the sassy, fierce Latina. As a young woman, I was so confused and disappointed for being unable to live up to this stereotype. How many times I really wish I was sassy and fierce just to feeling out of place for being the quiet Latina. And these are just a couple examples of how culture can influence on how we feel about ourselves as introverts. We might generate these insecurities that are the result of the world around us telling us all the time that there's something off. As introverts, we have this tendency of not speaking much, but we don't do because we are listening, not because we don't have anything to say. Sadly, sometimes people around might fill those gaps and then make us feel like there's something wrong. We might feel like our style doesn't have a place in the workplace, in leadership positions, within our own families. There's also this other aspect that I think about a lot, gender and introversion. It is general knowledge that 1/3 to 1/2 of the population identifies as introverts. And according to these studies, which, by the way, are studies made in the United States, women are not necessarily more introverted than men. On average, they are the same. But because all these bias and stereotypes, we know, for example, that women get to talk less in meetings. And all women struggle with this problem. But as introverted women, we have to deal with multiple intersections. We have to overcome other people's prejudices about introversion, but also about gender and race. Also, from early age, many women are told to be quiet, at least in my family and in my culture. Things are changing, but we still have a long way to go. Anyways, as quietness was something regarded when I was a kid, at some point I started wondering, is it my quietness result of this conditioning, or is actually introversion? Well, now I know it can be both. There is this other book that, in combination with quiet, helped me to understand myself better, and to understand that there might be some areas that one might want to work on. But there are some other things that you just have to embrace. You might want to address your shyness, but not really your introversion. This book in particular has a ton of information about science and research to understand various aspects of genetics, gender, behavior, and cognition. I really thought that part was very interesting. However, personally, I don't think it necessarily helped me to be more confident. And actually, I completely failed to find what I was looking for in this book, because when I read it, I had some fundamental misconceptions. Misconceptions about who can be a leader and what leadership is. I read the confidence code at some point in my career where I already had some years of experience in the industry, so I started to wonder what I want to do next. Do I want to be a manager? What skills do I need to be a leader? And if I want to be a leader, maybe I need to find out how to be more confident. So I read this book because confidence is one of those things that it usually gets associated with leaders, right? Well, bummer, like I said, that book didn't make me more confident or a leader, because, of course, being confident won't make you a leader, or at least not necessarily a good one. It was many years after when I realized about all these misconceptions and how they were related to my internalized bias and stereotypes about my own introversion. When I used to think about the concept of leadership, I will get so anxious because the majority of the notions that will come to my head will be a complete mismatch with my personality and the way that I approach problems. Some of those ideas were like this: the person who chose confidence. I just talked about how this made me read a whole book. And the thing is, of course, having confidence is a good thing, but that alone won't make you a leader. The person who speaks the most. I always wonder how people can speak and think so fast and so much at the same time. It's definitely skill. The most charismatic. We all have heard phrases like, oh, he's a very charismatic leader, right? The person who has a lot of contacts, that is sociable, and these last two are related, not for anything. We always hear that networking is so important. Or just plainly, I thought that leaders needed to be extroverts. And well, if you think that some of these ideas are nebulous and a bit random, well, you have all the right. But there is data to support that I might not be alone. Studies show that extroverts occupy more leadership positions than those who identify as introverts. In fact, a lot more than 90%. So, if all these characteristics don't necessarily make a leader, or a good one anyway, what does? A few years ago, I had an amazing coach and mentor, Carson, who, by the way, also spoke here at LeadDev a few years back. She is a person who I deeply admire and respect, and who helped me a lot in this leadership discovery journey. I hope one day she sees this talk, because we used to speak a great deal about this topic, and this talk in particular. In these conversations, I remember asking Erica, what is leadership anyway? I don't even know what does it mean to be a leader. And as a great coach she is, she used to ask me so many great questions. But there was one that I remember in particular. She asked me this: who do you admire? See, in many talks about introverts, you will hear people referring to these very famous introvert leaders. But Erica was not asking about them. She was asking about my colleagues in my company. Yes, famous introvert leaders are there. We should not forget them, but we don't have to go too far. Erica was so on point with this question because it allowed me to stop for a moment and appreciate my day-to-day fellow team members, some of which actually have inspired me to give this talk. So immediately after this exercise of reflection, I started to notice that the people that I have always looked up are mostly introverts. For me, all of them were leaders, and very few of them actually had a title that one might often associate with leadership, such as a manager. Many of them actually influence without authority. Many years it took me to understand that for me, leadership is all about shared values. And although I don't deny that a title helps a lot, especially if you're from an underrepresented group, you don't necessarily need one to advocate and model for those values that you believe in every single day. And that's exactly what I saw in these colleagues. So, we have talked about the misconceptions of both introversion and leadership, at least my misconceptions. But how can we align our understanding to see that there's room for different ways of leading and that introverts can be good leaders too? I would say we should take a chance on precisely those characteristics that identify us as introverts and see them as a strength. So in the next slides, I would like to talk about some of those values and characteristics that I saw in my colleagues and that now I personally strive for. Listening is a big one. Some of the best leaders I've met know how to really listen. And this sounds easy, but it's absolutely not. As introverts, we might have the advantage because we don't speak much, so we have more time to listen. But this is a skill that requires a lot of practice. But if done good, it can help you to build meaningful, strong relations. Another flavor of listening is when leaders pay attention and listen to other voices or explicitly seek those voices and incorporate them into solutions. And I mention this because seeking different voices and actually listen to them is very different. But good leaders know how to do both. Very similar to listening is observing. Good leaders that I have had in the past pay attention to their surroundings. One example of this is when people give you good feedback. Plenty has been said about how critical it is to give feedback. But in order to give it effectively, we first need to pay attention. I have had leaders who, when noticed something that I did, no matter how small it was, if it had an impact, they let me know and make me feel appreciated. Also, a different way in which observation practice can help is to identify gaps, risks, and patterns. For instance, I have had colleagues that have helped their teams to get unstuck just by pointing out gaps, or have helped to plan and mitigate risk that they saw before running into that problem. Or by noticing patterns, they have helped establish or streamline processes. I really like the talk by Luisa. I think this is a great example of those three things, identifying gaps, risk, and patterns. And because good leaders listen and observe, they know how to make great questions. And for me personally, I prefer questions over answers. How many times you're looking for an answer when what you actually need is a good question? Remember my example with Erica. Also, Samuel mentioned a little bit of this. He saw something, and then he asked, what is the problem? How can I help? That opens so many possibilities. Also, the colleagues that I admire are good at analyzing. They don't make rush or unilateral decisions. They take the time to outweigh options and make sure they incorporate other voices. This is related to listening. All these skills are interconnected. And when introvert leaders have an opinion, they advocate with conviction. And I do not take that lightly. Why? Because they did take the time to listen, observe, and analyze. Introvert leaders might feel so compelled to advocate for the things that they believe in that they can go out of their comfort zone. There is this psychologist called Brian Little who talks about the concept of acting out of character. We introverts do this a lot to be able to adapt into a world that benefits extroverts. But this has a high cost for us. We tend to burn out easily. So when an introvert speaks up, we should listen because that means they really care. This is also an important one for me. Good leaders are patient, they're kind, humble, and they are willing to work through problems and learn together. In some companies or cultures, quick action and results are admired. And of course, in some situations, this is a virtue. But leaders also need patience because that's ultimately what enables you to analyze the situation and to understand what is actually required. Quick action might give you quick results, but we always have to wonder how long those results will last. Patient leaders reinforce the importance of focusing on long-term outcomes. If you think about it, many tasks associated with leadership actually require a lot of patience. Strategic planning, mentoring, coaching. The bigger or the more complex the problem, the greater the patience that is required. For instance, some of the engineers that I most fondly remember are not the ones that work on the most shiny features, but those who had the patience to work on the little things to unblock others, to write that documentation, to write those tests, to advocate for those things that are even trickier, such as enabling good communication. Finally, not sure if this one is necessarily an introvert quality, but something that I've seen as a pattern. Introvert leaders are willing to show themselves as they are, despite what the world often tells you what a leader is. This creates a sense of safe space because you can say, hey, we are all different. Leaders come in all sizes and flavors. So this helps you to exercise the idea that you don't need to be a specific type of personality to be a leader. But also, I might be a bit biased because I've been fortunate to work with people and in companies that do appreciate introverts. And that has made me feel that you can be an effective leader in different ways. So, of course, I have talked a lot about introverts. And despite that, I hope some of the things that I mentioned here resonated with all of you. And, of course, I also know that we all need our extrovert and ambivert fellow team members with all your wonderful characteristics. But besides sharing those characteristics with your teams, how else can you help your introvert teammates? First, learning about introversion and attending talks such as this. So thank you for that. Then, listening to introverts, but also don't force them to talk. And I know this sounds contradictory, but let me explain. Of course, you should look for the introvert inside, but it won't be often on the big meetings. So instead of keep telling them that they should speak more in meetings, take some time to get to know them in one-on-ones and look for their thoughts there. We introverts really enjoy deep conversations. But you can't really get that in a big room with lots of people. However, when we do say something on these meetings, please listen, because we don't share things lightly. But most of all, honor their choices and their style. Please understand that when we are acting more extroverted, we are paying a high cost. So as much as we can, we should be allowed to say exactly the amount of words that we have to give. Well, that is pretty much for all I have, and for my fellow introverts, remember to appreciate yourself. And I want to share this quote from Susan Cain, or leave it as a reminder if you already read the book. As an introvert, you need to trust your gut and share your ideas as powerfully as you can. Notice she says powerfully and not loudly. So I ask you now, how are you sharing your ideas next? Thank you so much for listening.